Hello, my name's Jeff Heels. I'm going to be talking to you today about international trade. I've just had my breakfast. I wonder what you have for breakfast today. Perhaps something like me. Jam. What an ordinary, boring, everyday product. Yes, but when you think about it, it might be boring, but the people who make it love it. And for them, marketing it, selling it all over the world is their reason for being. And even a boring, ordinary product like this is actually quite complex when you're trying to sell it in international markets. Let's just think a bit about it. We've got the jam in the jar. Strawberry, apricot, raspberry. Really simple things. Yes, but we've still got to make jam. And believe it or not, in most of our developed countries, there are various standards about the jam itself. The standard is all about how much fruit and how much sugar it's made of. Within the European Union, there's actually a standard for jam. In order to have a product made of fruit and sugar and actually be able to call it jam, you've got to have at least 35% fruit and at least 60% sugar. Simple. And it's the same within all the countries of the European Union. So that's great. You make your product and you can sell it anywhere in the European Union. Of course, if we're looking at other countries, the first thing we need to do is to think about the legislation. Is there a standard for a product called jam? Well, if we're looking at the United States, for example, the standard for jam is 40% of fruit. Saudi Arabia, 28% fruit, but 65% minimum sugar. So obviously, we're starting to get a little bit more complicated. And the first thing we need to do is to find out about the legal framework for the product. And then manufacture the product which corresponds to the legislation. But even so, for the jam manufacturer, that's going to be perhaps a little bit more difficult than that. Because for the United States, if we're making strawberry jam for the American market, well, the minimum quantity we can manufacture is perhaps 1 ton. So we've got to be pretty sure of our market that we're going to sell all that before we make it. We've got the legislation then for the product itself. But we also need to take into account some of the commercial and specificities of each market. For example, perhaps even within the European Union, where everyone's got the same legislation, the Spanish will say, oh, could you not do this apricot jam with large pieces of fruit? That's what we like. Or perhaps the Germans who will ask for a jam which is easier to spread. So even within the legal framework of the product, there are commercial constraints that need to be taken into account in order to have the product which corresponds to the market. But as I said, that's what's in the jar. But there are 3 other things we need to take into account. We've got the jar itself, the top, and of course, the label. The jar. What kind of jar are we going to use for our international markets? What size? Perhaps 125 grams, 370 grams, 450 grams, or perhaps 454 grams. Because indeed, if we want to sell in the United States, we will have to sell 454 grams. Because 454 grams is 1 pound, and that is the system of weights and measures in the States. What type of jar? one of these boring, ordinary cylindrical jars, or perhaps a fancy one with special sloping slides to it. Yeah, why not? It's nicer. But, of course, the fancy jars are more expensive than the boring jars. And actually, to put a label on a jar which has got sloping sides, I need a special machine to put them on. So all of a sudden, I'm making 454 gram jars, pretty jars with sloping sides, and I now need to buy another machine to actually put the labels on. Well, it's got even more complicated all of a sudden. And then we've got the top, the lid. That's nice. This one's purple, but perhaps a white one would be just as nice. Or perhaps a fancy one. Or perhaps my customer wants one with a special design. Of course, we can do just about anything. But a boring white top is going to be cheaper than a fancy one. And of course, if I'm making or having made special fancy tops, then I'm going to have to find my supplier. And perhaps the minimum quantity for the tops is 100,000. Wow. All of a sudden I've got to be pretty sure of my market in order to be able to buy those lids and be sure to sell them. And of course I've got to have the cash available to buy them. And finally, the label. Yeah, what sort of label? Perhaps one like this. Different colours. Different colours. That'd be nice. But of course more expensive than a boring black and white label. What am I going to call it? What brand am I going to use? Can I use the brand that I use in my home market? Or perhaps something special for the foreign market, providing that that brand is available and has not already been registered by someone else? And of course, I've got to be careful not to use a brand that means something horrible in the local language. I've got to think about legislation, labeling legislation, which again will vary from country to country. Perhaps indeed the design of the label will be something else I need to consider. Again, I'm going to have to buy new labels. Where am I going to get them manufactured? How many am I going to buy? Am I going to be able to sell the products that I'm adapting really for my international markets? So you see, all of a sudden, just a boring product like this, when we're looking to export it and develop it internationally, it becomes quite complicated. But so we do it, and we've got the product, and we're ready to sell this to Saudi Arabia or Australia or America, special 50%, 454 grams, and so on. Great, but now we've got to find out who we're going to sell it to. Importers, we're going to use commission agents. We're going to have to negotiate with them. And then we're going to have to think about the practical side of things, of pricing, and taking into account the logistics, transport, insurance, customs. That's going to be interesting to look at as well. And of course, selling is great. Being paid is even better. How are we going to be paid? Lots of things then, from a simple, boring product that is the everyday food of any company doing international business. Hopefully, we'll have the chance of meeting again and being able to look at all of this in more detail. Thank you.